So extremely pleased to welcome Jim Wolfreys and Fatima Khemilat, who are going to discuss the issue of Islamophobia in France. So it's a very important and hot topic. I'm also particularly proud to welcome Jim because I've known Jim for quite some time now. I was lucky enough to have him as my PhD supervisor, so it's always nice to be able to welcome him in my university space after having spent so many years in his. So yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for accepting the invitation. I'm going to just briefly present both of our guests. Jim is Senior Lecturer in French and European Politics at King's College London. His research on contemporary French politics is focused on actually quite a wide range of topics. He's worked on the historiography of the revolution. He co-edited a book on the subject with, I think it was Mike Haynes at Versa. He's also worked on, quite substantially also on the work of Pierre Bourdieu. He's studied extensively social movements in the left. I mean, that's how actually I got to know him. It's through he has a really amazing module at King's on globalization and anti-globalization. And he has also done extensive research on fascism and the far right in France. And that was his PhD research was on that topic. He wrote a book, The Politics of Racism in France, which was published in the late 90s, 98, I think, which he published with Peter Fysh, which was published. There was a second edition in 2003. So that focused also on the rise of the Front National. And today, so I guess in continuity with this area of research, he'll be presenting his most recent book, which he published at the beginning of this year, which is The Republic of Islamophobia, The Rise of Respectable Racism in France. Our second guest is Fatima Khemilat, so I'm also very honored to welcome her today. She'll be our respondent for this evening. Fatima is a lecturer in political science at the Université Paris Est Créteil, and her research focuses on French Muslims' representation, French public authorities' attempts to regulate the visibility of Islam and Muslims' religious practices. She's an academic, but she's also a very engaged citizen. So she has participated in a number of forums. She has published, she has spoken in a variety of different events, so that's also why I'm extremely proud that we can have her here today. And she provides, I think, through her research, really fascinating and extremely timely accounts of the interrelated political, gender, and racial dimensions, dynamics of controversies surrounding Islam in France and Europe. So again, I'm really very, very pleased to welcome her here today as well. So just a few words on how we're going to structure this evening. Jim will begin with a 40-45 minute talk, essentially on his book, on his research. This will be followed by a 20-minute response from Fatima. And then the idea is to open up the discussion to the rest of the floor. So you will have, hopefully we'll have at least 40-45 minutes of questions and answers with the group. So I'll come back on the stage at that point and I'll act as kind of a moderator to try and just collect your questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions as well. So thank you very much. So if you could just, well, again, welcome, and Jim, pass over the mic.
Thanks very much, Edouard, and that was very nice of you. And thanks for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for coming. I want to start not with France, but just with the question of Islamophobia internationally. If you look at the acts and rhetoric of the Trump administration, the references by Trump to Muslims as sick people, the reference by his former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn to Muslims as people who drink the blood of their dying enemies. We don't have to look very far to see that Islamophobia is an international phenomenon. it's estimated that half of all Muslim households in the United States have been affected in some way by FBI investigations into 9/11. Trump threatened to set up a database of all Muslims resident in the US, and as we know, established a Muslim ban affecting 7 predominantly Muslim countries. We could also look at Britain. Former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has made a series of statements that wouldn't be at all out of place at Front National meetings, most recently referring to women who wear the burqa as looking like letterboxes, comparing them to bank robbers, or the Prevent strategy, ostensibly a counter-terrorism initiative established under a Labour government, continued under the Tories, which has institutionalised prejudice against Muslims that's resulted in the referral of thousands of children, so under 15 years old, to government anti-radicalisation programmes, including several hundred children under 10 years old. So there are common features to these different trajectories of Islamophobia. The identification of Muslims as some kind of enemy within, the deployment of legislation to monitor, to scrutinise them, attempting, and this is an important point, measures that attempt to draw wider layers of the population into discriminatory processes, to ensure a degree of compliance with anti-Muslim measures that boost the authority of the state on the one hand, and that turn Muslims into racialized objects of suspicion. There are tens of thousands of public sector workers in Britain who are obliged to undergo mandatory training in anti-radicalisation programs through Prevent. So France isn't alone in experiencing a dramatic rise in Islamophobic acts, laws, and rhetoric. But the depth and the breadth of the problem in France, the way that Islamophobia has become embedded in the way that institutions operate, I argue has been much greater in France. So what I want to do is look at some of the reasons behind that, and behind the way that Islamophobia has developed. And this we can divide up into several different intersecting trajectories. So firstly, the context, the international context of the war on terror and the stigmatization of Muslims as an enemy within. Secondly, the adoption of an authoritarian neoliberal outlook by mainstream political parties. Then, and this is particular to France, an increasingly intolerant interpretation of Republican secularism, of the tradition of laicity, that has become a respectable tool for stigmatizing France's Muslim population. All of this taking place within a context of increasing social polarization. So polarization structured by inequality that produces fear, a sense of insecurity, and provides a context for scapegoating and racism. And finally, although the list isn't exhaustive, the exhaustion of the Socialist Party's capacity to play a meaningful anti-racist role, and the inability of the radical left and the wider anti-racist movement to mount an effective national challenge to this drift in French society. So I'll try and deal with these different points in turn. There's a brilliant book by Aaron Kundnani called The Muslims Are Coming that shows in great detail how since 9/11 governments have drawn on an explanatory framework that links the origins of terror with an ideology rooted in a foreign culture. So that links terror to Islam, and so obscures other problematic issues like the role of Western intervention in providing motivations for terrorist attacks. So we've seen the stigmatization of Muslim culture as some kind of enemy within, as a barrier to integration, a barrier to social mobility, but that above all identifies Muslims above all as representatives of their religion rather than individuals in their own right. So Kundnani links the war on terror to the Cold War. So essentially says it's a revival of tropes and mechanisms developed during the Cold War. There's an enemy within that's loyal to a foreign power that requires monitoring, that people need to be wary of. I think in France, the kind of tropes and mechanisms that have been deployed are much more to the colonial era. So the caricature of the Muslim women as the Muslim woman as passive and dealing with violent, domineering, authoritarian Muslim men. So there's an overlap between Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and France's colonial mission civilisatrice. So this mission is based on France's particular interpretation of universalism. So although the values of universalism are applicable in theory to the whole of humanity, its origins are French. So it's also defined by the dominant features of France's social hierarchy. So this requires a degree of invisibilization of people who are different. People must leave their particular baggage behind if they want to be part of this club. So I want to talk about this a bit more later. So this essentialization of Muslims is part of a form of social discipline. Doubt is cast on the desirability of Muslim presence in France, and the authority of the state is constantly reinforced by invoking the need for suspicion and monitoring. So this reaches a high point with the state of emergency, aspects of which are now incorporated into the Constitution. So these narratives, so the emphasis on an alien culture and its negative impact on national culture, dovetail with developments that have been taking place in France since the 1970s. So I'm thinking of the ideas developed by the so-called Nouvelle Droite, so far-right activists and intellectuals, who explicitly and consciously, over a number of years, emphasized the need to transform the way racism operated. And if you go back and look at some of the debates that took place on the French far right in the post-war period, there's a very strong emphasis on the need to adapt racism for a new era. So to focus less explicitly on race and to emphasize more cultural aspects. So in other words, racist ideas were disseminated under the guise of preoccupations with the question of integration. The problem with North Africans in France isn't that they're Arabs or have dark skin, it's their religion. Islam makes them incompatible with the values of the of the Republic. And this was a very strong element in the resurgence of the far right. So, culture then is able to play the same role as race. It operates as a hidden force that explains the behaviour of a whole group of people. So it's a rule that can be applied everywhere to anything that Muslims do. So it produces the same outcomes as more overt discriminatory language that has the huge advantage of not appearing racist. It's a much more genteel, respectable form of racism, whereby cultural signifiers like wearing the hijab function in very similar ways to more overtly racial markers like skin colour. So Islamophobia functions as a form of prejudice that emphasises culture rather than race, but transmits a message about race all the same. And this has contributed to a shift in attitudes that's taken place since the turn of the century, where debates about diversity and difference that began to surface in the 80s and 90s have given way to a much more accusatory stance that questions the authenticity of certain categories of people when it comes to being truly French. So notably those with an immigrant background, Muslims in particular. So it's a shift that's been accelerated by the focus on incidents and episodes that have taken on the status of moral panic. So I could spend the rest of the evening just talking about these incidents, but if you think of Marine Le Pen saying when she sees Muslims praying in the street, it reminds her of the Nazi occupation of France. What happens next? The government bans prayers in the street. Think of the debate about halal meat. Manuel Valls, as Interior Minister, personally intervenes to ensure that prisons don't serve halal meat to Muslim prisoners. Nicolas Sarkozy, in his failed attempt to win a third presidential nomination from his party, saw him declare at one meeting, people will remember this, that school students who didn't want to eat meat at school should instead get a double portion of chips. C'est ça la République, was his intervention in the campaign. Think of the endless debates about the hijab that's eventually banned in schools in 2004, all framed by a universalist justification. The law applies to all manifest or conspicuous religious symbols, but is preceded by years of debate, going back to the late 80s, about the hijab, the establishment of a commission to examine this issue, not the problem of outsized crosses or other examples of religious affiliation. So, following the passing of that legislation, we've seen the extension of the focus on the hijab to other garments. So, students who took off their hijab but covered their hair with a bandana were suddenly ostracized from school. One case went to the Council of State because a student covered her hair with a bandana, and this was interpreted as a religious garment, as opposed to white students who like Rihanna and choose to cover their hair with a bandana. So the ban on the niqab and the burqa in 2010 followed a similar logic. The law bans the covering of the face in public. Months of debate are devoted to the problem of the niqab, rather than the problem of people wearing balaclavas or ski masks or motorcycle helmets. The law is nevertheless presented as universal. It applies to everyone. And it results in episodes like the incident at the Bastille Opera a few years ago, where a woman sitting in one of the front rows of the La Traviata at the Bastille Opera is spotted by members of the chorus who go off stage and say, "We won't go back out after the interval unless that woman is removed from the auditorium." She's on holiday from the Gulf, doesn't know anything about the band, is approached by security in the opera. They take her out of the auditorium in line with the legislation that prevents people from covering their face in public. The chorus can then go on to perform the masked ball scene in La Traviata because of special dispensation written into the legislation, allowing people to do so when it comes to sporting or theatrical events. So, I suppose the picture I'm trying to paint is one of a distortion of universalism, the weaponization of laicity as a tool for discrimination against Muslims. One very striking episode in this sense was the televised presidential debate between François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy in 2012, a debate that underlines the extent to which the authority of the Republican state becomes invoked in order to police infinitely trivial matters. So we're talking about a debate that takes place in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. Two men vying to become head of state of the world's fourth largest economy choose to devote a fairly considerable part of that debate to the challenge posed to the traditions and values of the Republic by an aqua gym class in a municipal swimming pool, where a group of obese women said, "We feel uncomfortable about having our aqua gym class in front of everybody else. We'd like to have a separate class." The press find out that a number of these women are Muslim, and it's presented as an assault on the values of the Republic because of this small group of women trying to seek a degree of privacy in a local swimming pool. On the campaign trail, Sarkozy draws himself up to the full height of his 5 centimetres stacked heels and says, "On the territory of the Republic, there will be no separate swimming classes for women." So you couldn't get a more evocative example of the distortion of both universalism and the way in which the priorities of the state were shifting. I'll come on to that a bit more later. So this relentless fabrication of moral panics around what Muslims eat, how they swim, what they wear when they swim, that we saw with the burkini ban, who they swim with, what they wear to school. All of this has had a huge impact on France's Muslim population. So there are a number of reports carried out by the Consultative Commission of the Rights of Man that identify Muslims as the most stigmatized minority in France in successive reports, subject to increasing mistrust. The reports note the way that racist language was becoming more commonplace, feeding off the exploitation of issues like national identity, immigration, and religion in political debate. Respondents in opinion polls were becoming much more confident about expressing racist views, and anti-Muslim acts were also rising with every year, with women as the primary victims, subject to nearly 80% of Islamophobic attacks, and those wearing the hijab the principal target of these. So what the Commission also noted was the development of ethnocentric authoritarianism, so linking rising ethnocentrism to a desire to impose the dominant norms of society on the other. Other, they said, by their origin, religion, culture, but also their sexual practices, by force, if necessary. So, obviously a major role in the construction of Islamophobia as a central aspect of political debate has been played by the existence of a party devoted to pushing racism as a central issue in French politics. So the presence and the durability of the Front National has played a huge role in this process. But the radicalization of laïcité has been a gift to Marine Le Pen, who was able to seize on it to both accentuate the radicalization of laïcité, but also to present herself as a moderate figure, simply defending Republican values against challenges to Republican orthodoxy. So in this sense, the presentation of Marine Le Pen as a more moderate figure than her father, as a legitimate Republican politician with a softer image, a more feminine image and so on, the so-called dédiabilisation, the detoxification of the Front National has contributed to this spiral of Islamophobia. So this despite the fact that a number of studies have shown that the apparent detoxification of the FN has been a very useful mask that the organisation can wear while a radicalisation of its membership has been taking place. So polling over a number of years of Front National members and supporters shows that they express alarming levels of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and ethnocentrism. More than 8 out of 10 Front National sympathisers describe themselves as racist, 3/4 have a negative view of Muslims, over half express very strong anti-Semitic views, a third consider Jews to be not fully French. So the question we'd ask is, with detoxification like this, who needs radicalisation? But one of the reasons why this radicalisation looks like a more moderate development is because of another process that's taking place in parallel, which is the radicalisation of the mainstream right. So this radicalisation has its roots in an ongoing and very deep-seated crisis of political representation in France. So despite and certainly in Britain, Macron's election victory was greeted as a triumph of liberal values over authoritarianism and racism. But it was a parliamentary majority for his party achieved with only 15% of registered voters in the first round of the June parliamentary election. Half of the 8 million people who voted for Macron in the first round of the presidential election said they did so by default, to block another candidate. So in other words, there's a long-standing problem that mainstream parties have in France to win enthusiastic, popular affiliation to neoliberal economic policies. And it's this that's contributed to a process whereby parties seek support via scapegoating and stigmatisation, seek to bolster the authority of the state by other means. So the apparent impotence of the state when it comes to stemming widening inequalities or directing the economy is compensated for by asserting the mastery of the state over street prayers, school dinners, bandanas, aquagym classes. So Sarkozy, as I say, is the perfect embodiment of this Republican inferiority complex, very much like the Berlusconi phenomenon in Italy. A response to the crisis of political representation. So to short-circuit declining political affiliation to parties by taking the presidentialization of politics one step further, marketing Sarkozy like a celebrity around this deliberately constructed bling-bling presidency. But what the presidency did was to further the radicalization of the UNP and later the Republican. So again, internal polling of UNP members and supporters shows in 2006 just over 60% of UNP voters expressed the view that there were too many immigrants in France. By 2013, this had risen to nearly 90%. So a similar shift took place on issues of security. So in other words, this ethnocentric authoritarianism becomes increasingly entrenched in the outlook of the principal party of the mainstream right. So a turning point in this process of radicalization was the decision of the mainstream right following Chirac's election in 2002 to make laïcité a centerpiece of its program. It's this process that has eased the convergence of international and domestic trajectories of Islamophobia. So laïcité, in other words, traditionally the preserve of the left, becomes a mobilizing tool for the right from 2002. So it's a tradition that is full of compromises, of contradictions, ostensibly a tradition that manages diversity, that ensures neutrality in public space, becomes mobilized increasingly as a tool of intolerance, and is all the more powerful for being invoked as something that is a long-standing French tradition. And we know this from the constant references to the 1905 law of separation of church and state that's used as a kind of sacrosanct benchmark to justify legislation like the ban on the hijab and so on. Now there's lots of work that's been done on this secular tradition by people like Jean Baudrillard, who show during the debate in 1905 on the separation of church and state, an amendment was tabled to prevent priests from wearing ecclesiastical robes, the soutane, in public space. It was argued that this garment was a provocation, that it infringed freedom and human dignity, that it was proselytizing attire. So much of the language that we've heard over the past couple of decades, that it rendered the priest a prisoner or a slave to his religion. And the deputies debating the law overwhelmingly reject these separations. Aristide Briand, principal author of the law, says the day after separation, the soutane becomes a garment like any other. They adopt instead an amendment that expresses, that extends freedom of religious expression in public space. The principle behind the amendment they eventually adopt is absolutely unequivocal. Respect for freedom of conscience leads to the mutual respect of beliefs and not to the prohibition of external manifestations of a religious cult in public. We contrast this to today. In 2016, extracts were published from the brevet examination taken by 16-year-olds in school. One of the questions they were asked was to define laicity. A number of the responses saw laicity, had internalized laicity as a means of defending the predominant culture. The principle of laicity, one of the answers by one of the students said, principle of laicity is to respect the Christian religion. Others believed it was a way of erasing other cultures. The principle of laicity is that you shouldn't show your origins at school or elsewhere. My favourite one, and perhaps the most eloquent of all of them, was laicity is believing what I want, but without showing it. So it's not simply a question of the radicalization of laicity. It's not simply a question of this was a progressive tradition and now it's been distorted. Laicity has always been the subject of confusion and contradiction and compromise. Part of what laicity does is enables the state to produce obedient religious subjects. So it's always been a contested field. At the moment, things are going in a particular direction. And as I say, that's partly because of the wider context of the war on terror, but also because of a broader context of rising inequality in France. And there's something particular about France when it comes to this question. If we look at the period up to 2008, income inequality in France remains relatively stable from the 1980s to the 2008 financial crash. From that point, there's a very sharp break with the long-term trend. Inequality after the financial crash increases more rapidly in France than almost anywhere else. So that's part of the explanation. There's also a longer-term shift in attitudes that takes place that's not necessarily unique to France. But it's that since the 1990s, social mobility has stalled. Social mobility has been blocked for significant sections of the population. And this produces a major change in attitudes. The optimism that characterises the post-war period, the years of the long boom and so on, gives way to anxiety, fear, insecurity. For the first time since the war, belief in social progress isn't taken as a given. Parents no longer assume that their children will have more opportunities than they did. Most parents believe that poverty is a more likely prospect for their children than it was for them. Most children believe it will be more difficult for them to find a job when they grow up. So recession and austerity put paid to the sense of optimism embodied by an aspirant middle class that emerges in the post-war boom. So the political assault on the public sector, on pensions, on social security, and so on, the generation of economic and social security uproots many of the certainties that made middle-class life relatively comfortable. So uncertainty about salaries, about career prospects, about redundancies, about pensions, breeds increasing levels of frustration and disquiet. So the sense that there was a middle-class dream of prosperity that was within everybody's reach gives way to anxiety. So the middle class no longer spreads confidence throughout society, but spreads anxiety. And it's in this context of widening social polarization, insecurity, and so on, that the debates about integration take place and focus on the inability of Muslims to integrate. Now, it's not until 2008-9 that any major study of the question of a person's origins and skin colour and how they affect the social chances available to them. Not until 2008-9 with the report eventually published in 2015 called Trajectoire et Origine, that these questions become the subject of a major study in France. So this research, conducted over a decade, involving over 20,000 respondents, looks at what they call evidence of asymmetrical integration. So the children of immigrants obtain educational qualifications, they find friends and partners who aren't from migrant backgrounds, frequently put to one side their parents, language. So, in other words, do what they're supposed to do, achieve a level of social integration. But what they do isn't matched by society's capacity to offer economic integration. They spend longer unemployed than the so-called majority population and feel discriminated against. So one of the authors of the study, Patrick Simon, talks about the problem lying with French society and its institutions. The descendants of immigrants are doing the work of integration, but when the dynamic should come from French society, obstacles appear. So these kind of setbacks are what politicians attribute to cultural shortcomings on the part of racialized individuals. They're communitarian, they segregate themselves away, they're polygamous, they're misogynistic, they're submissive, they're violent, they're unwilling to integrate. The evidence presented in the study shows that both the children and the parents who migrated to France and their children were much more likely to find themselves in rundown estates or in temporary contracts, in unskilled or part-time work or unemployment, whatever their qualifications were, not because of their own failure to play a part in society, but because of the barriers put in their way by a society that was unable adequately to confront discrimination or inequality. What the political climate does, you think of the debates around the banlieue, in 2005-6, after the uprising in the banlieue. Gérard Larcher, employment minister at the time, so who oversaw 40% youth unemployment rates in the banlieue, argues the principal reason for this unrest is polygamy. Absent fathers mean children don't have role models and are more likely to be unemployed, and so on. So the political climate obscures the reality of what's taking place, obscures the reality of discrimination, and produces a distorted picture of what society looks like. So the director of Ipsos, the opinion poll firm, argues France is the country where we see the greatest gap between perception and reality on the question of immigration. So one poll asks people to say what percentage of the French population was made up of immigrants. So estimates vary, but the figure is 10% or under. Respondents put the figure at 28%. So the way these debates are internalized within French society imagines that 28% of the population are immigrants. When it comes to Muslims, perceptions are even more distorted. So again, estimates vary, but generally put an estimated figure of France's Muslim population around 8%. Respondents, when asked what percentage of the French population is Muslim, 31%. So just over half the respondents in this polling, 51%, believe there were too many Muslims in France. Around a third don't consider Muslims to be French like the others. Now, what's interesting here, so similar numbers, 51% thought there were too many North Africans in France. What's interesting is in 1966, a similar proportion of respondents thought there were too many North Africans in France. It wasn't the issue that it is today. It didn't dominate public debate. There weren't calls for legislation to be passed, policing Muslims in schools and so on. So in other words, racist attitudes can be present in society as latent views or sentiments without being taken up and legitimized and embedded in the political arena. So, in other words, what political elites are doing is not simply reflecting popular views, not simply responding to concerns about immigration or Islam, but are participating in the construction of political issues, shaping opinion, not simply following opinion. So this gap between perception and reality, the hold that racist and Islamophobic ideas have taken among significant sections of society as political issues, is also partly due to the decline of anti-racism in France. And this decline can be traced back partly to divisions opened up by the debate over the hijab. Some anti-racist groups back the ban. Members of anti-racist or radical left organisations participate in the stigmatisation of Muslims, in some cases leading calls for the banning of the hijab in schools, or playing a major role in the exclusion of Muslim students from schools. And despite the resurgence of the Front National under Marine Le Pen, we've seen very few, if any, national demonstrations against the organisation. Nothing, for example, on the scale of what happened in 2002 between the two rounds of the presidential election, and certainly no major anti-racist demonstration in France for over a decade, when events have been organised to confront the issue of Islamophobia. Participants have been castigated for associating themselves with Muslim groups and individuals. So, just to conclude, really, one of the functions that secularism has played in contemporary France has been to displace economic, social, and political questions onto the fields of ethnicity, culture, and religion. So opposition to rising inequality has in part been disarmed or muted by the construction of an enemy within. So Said Bouamama has written extensively on these questions, argues if we look at the neoliberal project's attempts to reverse social gains made since the war, so in particular when it comes to the field of education, it's no surprise that schools should be held up as the site of an essential battle against an enemy within. So the construction of a communitarian threat symbolised by the headscarf means that laicity, as Bouamama puts it, is mobilised to mask the reality of social divisions, to unite what the neoliberal project divides, and to divide what it unites. So what I'm trying to describe is a series of overlapping and mutually reinforcing trajectories that combine to produce a very powerful Islamophobic backlash. One of the most striking examples of its power is the fact that even the term Islamophobia is still questioned. So if these divisions and this prejudice is to be contested or dismantled, it's hard to see how this will happen without the development of an anti-racist response that establishes a set of political priorities that begins with the principle of defending stigmatized groups in society, and an understanding that this has to take precedence over whatever differences people might have over questions of religion.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here and honored to discuss the book of Jim Wolfreys. I would like to start by thanking very much and very warmly Edward for having invited me here. So it's a very sensitive and touchy topic, especially in France, because as you know, or as you might know, Islamophobia is not seen as a legitimate topic and issue to discuss about, especially in the academic field. So I think it's very important to have this discussion precisely here in a university settled in France, even if it's University of London. It's okay, it works. So, I also would like to say that I was very amazed to see with the amount of subtleties and the accuracy of your book, because actually for someone who lives abroad, you really caught French situation and what were the tensions in France when it comes to Islamophobia and to discuss this very specific kind of racism. It's a very complete book, and is it here? No. I hope you will buy it. Anyway, I have no royalties on it, but just to tell you that it's a very complete book, and in this book, the author, Jim, really tried to give a glance of the sociological and the historical, the history of the debate around Islamophobia. I would like to start with a quote, but this quote is not from the book. Actually, it's a sentence that I heard when I was in a café débat around post-colonial studies. This quote is: "Being anti-Arab is racist and is racism. Being anti-Muslim is philosophy." So it's a real sentence that I heard when I was in this café débat, and that was very interesting to hear it in this in the context, because like this debate and the exchanges were about post-coloniality, and they were about Frantz Fanon, the writer. And this writer made a point to say that in Algeria, specifically during the anti-colonial struggles, the French Empire used Islam as a way to disqualify, as a way to fight the Algerian fighters, saying that Islam was a barbaric religion and that women should be protected from it. But we will see a little bit more about it. Why did I choose to start by this quote about being anti-Arab is racism, but being anti-Muslim is philosophy? Because I think it's a good way to figure out the French debates around Islamophobia. Because in France now you can see that there is a huge switch from the race to religion as a legitimate marker and a civilizational benchmark, as Jim Wolfreys said it earlier. It's not specific to French situation because actually you can also hear a little bit about it in the United States, especially if you read the book of Michel Alexander called The New Jim Crow, a very famous book about the mass incarceration of Afro-Americans in the States. Why can we say that it's not the same, but it's the kind of a similar logic? Because in the States, fighting crimes, fighting criminals, this kind of rhetoric was used in order to put Afro-Americans in jail. And what Brian Stevenson, a very famous lawyer, used to say, this idea of law and order, this idea of fear and anger was very used in order to keep going, to carry on all that anger, all that amount of anger of white middle class against Afro-Americans, but trying to make it respectable and trying to make it trying to make it legitimate on a public debate. So it's exactly the same kind of rhetoric and discourses that you can find in France. We are not talking anymore about race, but because we don't. I mean, in France we don't talk about race. Race doesn't exist. It's not seen as a legitimate issue. It's very, for French people, it's very surprising to hear Americans talking about race and saying that they are black, or I don't know, they are Asian, or they are white. In France, if you say to a white folk that he is white, he is going to be very mad at you. Why? Because in France we think that race doesn't matter in this universal way that James Wolfreys said earlier. If we don't talk about race, that probably means that it doesn't exist. But surprisingly enough, it does. But one of the very interesting points in this book is also the idea of having a continuum of racism in France, despite the political alternation. As you wrote it, from Jacques Chirac, who was one of the former French presidents who passed the law against the veil in France, to Nicolas Sarkozy, who launched the topic and the debate around national identity and immigration. There is a link, there is this idea that there is a bound between immigration and the threat of national identity. And the very interesting point with the idea of being anti-Arab is racism, but being anti-Muslim is philosophy. It's that for left-wing members, religion is still seen, especially in France, as a threat to Republican values. And it's something very deep entrenched in the French way to see the Republic history. I'm sorry for my English, I hope your ears are not bleeding right now. But anyway, it has been a while since I've given a speech in English. Anyway, so for the left wing, saying that you are anti-Arab, it's not possible, but being anti-Muslim is more than possible. It's something that you should be proud of. So I think it's very specific for the French situation, and because Islamophobia is seen as something that you can argue that it's a way to fight and to counter actually all the attempts to minimize and undermine the right of blasphemy and freedom of speech. So it's seen as, for a lot of left activists, as something that we should do and we should be willing to do. This unification, because the very interesting point is, like, if you are anti-Muslim or if you are anti-Arab, actually you are targeting the same population. So it's the same population, but the narratives are changing a little bit, depending on which side you are on the political chest. So they are actually unifying around the idea that there is a problem with Muslims, there is a problem with immigrants. And one of these problems is the women issues and the women's condition and situation in French suburbs. So the French situation is slightly different because in France the poor are actually outside the city. They are living in suburbs, French banlieue, and it's very interesting to see that these territories are seen as foreign territories, as if they were not a part, actually, of French territory. And there is this sentence that you quoted in the book, the lost territories, les territoires perdus de la République, the lost territories of Republic, and that is directly targeting these suburbs and les banlieues. So the idea that the people from banlieue are endangering women is very, very widespread and very common in France. And for them, the fact that there are more women wearing a hijab in these neighborhoods is an evidence that there is a problem with the equality in this neighborhood. So it's also very convenient, actually, to say that the sexism is only a product of these Muslims and this era, because it helps to undermine and to invisibilize the sexism and all the violence against women, which are done and executed by white and privileged people in downtown, in the cities. Today, for example, George Tron, who is a French but a French politician, was acquitted he was prosecuted and sued for sexual assault, and today he was acquitted. So I don't think, and as you said, that French political class does care about the situation of women, but when it comes to use women's rights and women's struggles against a part, a minority of his own population, they do unify and do what Eric Fazin, who is a French author, say, the sexual democracy. So when the sexuality, the feminism, and the rights of LGBT communities are used in order to disqualify, to target, and to scapegoat Muslim minorities. So that was very interesting also to see all of this debate summarized in the book. It's also a way to depict Muslims are uncivilized and savage people who and especially to present women as to be protected, Muslims and Muslim and Arab women are to be protected from their own community. So laicite became a very common, a very convenient flag in which left and right-wing members grabbed themselves in order to hide their bigotry and sexism, in order to make it respectable. But it's also a way to undermine the economical and racial and territorial issues around the presence of Muslim, a strong and huge Muslim community in France. So in order to resonate a little bit with your talk, I would like to, because I was quite surprised to not see the issue of organizing Muslim representation in France as a part of the Islamophobic enterprise. So I would like to know if you think that there's different attempts to organize Islam in France, such as le Conseil français du culte musulman and different organizations is a part of not of this Islamophobic dynamic going on in our government. The other point I would like to discuss maybe a little bit is about what you call a moral panic, and how we can say that it's almost irrational. This fear is almost irrational because there is this idea that it becomes a real obsession for a lot of people actually in France. And during your talk, you spoke a little bit also about the economical issue, and especially the deconstruction of the welfare state. And I would like to hear a little bit more about it, and also about the fact that during the different attacks in Paris, occurring in Paris and in France, just right after that, we had a lot of discussions around the organization of Islam and the legitimacy of having Muslim people living in France. So there is a huge link between the political and public agenda and events such as attacks and the different reforms launched in order to organize Islam. So I don't know if you worked a little bit about it. It's pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, and I would really like to thank you for responding in English, especially as a very bad organizer, I forgot to specify.
It's okay.
So I feel extremely guilty and responsible, but I think you did extremely, extremely well. So what I thought we'd do is, I think Jim will respond, I think, to the comments you made, but what I thought of doing is maybe, given the time we have left, to already also open the floor to questions. So when you ask your question, if you could just 2 seconds, just briefly present yourself before you ask your questions, that would be great. What I will do is run around the room with the microphone, so just, yeah, if you want to raise your hands if you have questions. Are there any questions at this stage? Yes? 2? Okay, so I'll just pass the microphone. So you can maybe take those 2 questions first, then you can respond, and then go for another round of questions after.
Hello, my name's Emily. I'm in 3rd year at ULIP, and I'm currently doing a dissertation on the identification of Northern African immigrants in the banlieue, Paris. So my question is, how do you think that the state's policing of Muslims in France contributes to the rise of respectable racism, specifically the police force, and mainly after the 2005 riots and then the state of emergency after the attacks? Thanks.
Hello, I had a question because you said there has been very little open opposition to of racism in France, and I was wondering if you could identify any efforts or instances where you say there has been an effort to disarm racism in France.
Okay, shall I try and respond to some of those? I think that where to start? If we part of the argument in the book is that in the context of this argument about inequality, so to come back to some of your points first. Yes, France has seen a very rapid rise in inequality since 2008, but there have been long-standing debates and confrontations over the question of the welfare state. So one of the reasons why inequality was mitigated, its effects were mitigated, was because of a system of redistribution that's been under attack. And so the social movement was a very powerful force in French society, even if it wasn't necessarily taken into the political field. All you have to do is read The Economist and say the problem facing Chirac and then Sarkozy is the social movement is blocking the necessary reform to make France a modern industrial power without the shackles of a welfare state. So I'm not arguing that there was a kind of conspiracy, how can we divide this? It's one of the consequences of the debate over the hijab was, and that's why the quote about secularism uniting what neoliberalism divides and dividing what it unites. What you saw were, the most striking example was perhaps in the early part of the century when you had big teachers' mobilizations, and then you saw those teachers demonstrating alongside Claude Allais, the education minister, imposing the cuts on teachers and the minister uniting to call for a ban on the hijab. So it sowed confusion and division within a movement that was at several points very very powerful. So I think it's in that context that these kind of moral panics and so on develop. And I think there wasn't time to go into the book spends quite a bit of time on the question of the banlieue and the riots and the language that was used around that. And I think that it's interesting, the question of the police. I mean, it's very clear, talking to people who were involved in that uprising in 2005, that resentment at the police and how they operate in those areas, stopping people, harassing them and so on, created an enormous well of built-up frustration and anger that exploded in 2005, but exploded in the face of provocation and a deliberate attempt by Nicolas Sarkozy, I think, to inflame that issue. So when we talk about this link between race and culture producing the same impact, what I'm saying is that the focus on culture provides a more respectable framework, but transmits a message about race all the same. So parallel to what's been happening, the kind of things I've described, has been the use of terms like radical by prominent politicians. The attacks on people like Christian Taubira, referred to as a monkey. The fact that Daniela Bono, the deputy for La France Insoumise, goes on television for the first time since after she got elected, and is asked whether she feels like shouting "Vive la France." Nobody would ask of a white MP. So there's in other words, a fueling of more outright racism that takes place as well. And I think in terms of what was interesting in terms of to come back to the policing question, is that the police's own internal reports, so the secret services and the police produced reports about the riots where they said the role of Islam in this uprising was nil. That Islam had no role to play in the riots, and that the people who were arrested were for the most time first-time offenders. So their internal reports contrasted absolutely with what politicians were saying about this is ce sont des voyous, these are criminals who are motivated by their religion. Fox News in the States had a strapline throughout the uprising that just said Muslim riots. as if that was a given. So to come back to the question of the Conseil Français du Culte Musulman, I think that that's part of what I'm trying to say about secularism, is that the state isn't simply a benign observer of developments in society that simply ensures neutrality in a benevolent fashion. It's trying to, that's the function of state actors, is to try and exert a degree of control over society. And I think the CFCM was an attempt to say, we decide who our Muslim interlocutors are, and we'll appoint the people we want to oversee that process. And I think it was also part of Sarkozy's very conflicted and inconsistent attitude towards questions of religion, where at one moment he'll say Catholicism is absolutely central to French identity and plays a privileged role, and then presents himself as a champion of secularism. So I think there's a very good book by Jeremy Ahern called Government Through Culture that describes the process post-2002 where laicity becomes like has a kind of bleed in it, like a snowball effect. And so it creates a spiral where politicians get locked into a process of what he calls bid and counterbid. So at one stage it looks as if Sarkozy is presenting himself as a kind of neoconservative modernizer of republicanism, so he won't be tied to he makes a speech attacking de Villepin where he says, with unemployment levels like this, why should we defend the Republican model? But then he's canny enough to see the direction that political debate is going, and so then jumps into this spiral and becomes very much a part of it. So, did I miss something? There was the police, and there was the
opposition.
Yes, sorry. Yes, absolutely. Yes, and so I felt it was very important to have voices from people trying to organise against Islamophobic attacks, and there is a section of the book that contains interviews with what I'd say were representatives of a particular current in anti-racism who emphasised the need for a political anti-racist response. So meaning that, I'm talking about people who have been involved in initiatives specifically targeting the question of Islamophobia, who are essentially saying that moral anti-racism no longer suffices, that once you have forms of racism that have this level of respectability and are embodied in the way that institutions function, then you need a response that takes on the question of how racism becomes structural. That it's not enough just to say racism is a bad opinion, because even Boris Johnson will agree with that. But you have to identify the way in which it becomes embedded in the way institutions function, and therefore it has to be a much deeper and far-reaching approach. And I would say that there are examples of anti-racist responses to things like the debate over national identity. I mean, the debate was effectively scuppered before it began because it was discredited by the work of all those people who petition and mobilise against it in a similar way to the measure that the government attempted to introduce, insisting that schools teach the positive benefits of French colonial rule, that was knocked back. And there are initiatives the March for Dignity and so on that takes place every year, where people are attempting to organise. What's been lost is the capacity to make links between, I suppose, a core of political activists agitating around those questions and much broader layers of the population. And I think that's what, I don't think that France is any more racist a country than Great Britain or the United States. I think it's a question of a political balance of forces and what capacity do people have to beat back the drift that's taking place. So there are particular examples like the 2006 law on teaching colonialism in schools, the backlash against national identity. What you haven't had is an adequate response to the challenge of what do you do when 10 million people vote for an openly racist party in a presidential election? Where are the mobilisations of school students and huge demonstrations that we saw in 2002? What's happened to that? So that demands much more than just saying racism is wrong. It demands a more thought out political response that links those questions of why has the FN become so respectable? Why has Islamophobia become so respectable? Why have we allowed these laws to embed prejudice and ensure compliance from people who are in no way anti-racist, but exactly in the same way as with the Prevent agenda in Britain, are drawn into discriminatory practices through a process of compliance, and that requires the political confidence to defy them.
Fatima, do you want to briefly, well, sorry, not even briefly, do you want to just respond? And then we'll take another round of questions.
So that's fine, and then we'll take some more questions after. Yeah. Fatima is just asking, are you okay if she responds in French?
Okay, thank you.
Alors non, je voulais juste revenir sur la question du lien entre du coup le culturel et le religieux. Je pense que l'illusion et l'erreur serait de croire que c'est quelque chose de nouveau. En fait, c'est quelque chose qui existe au moins depuis le XVe siècle, avec notamment le décret qui avait été adopté par la reine Isabelle en Espagne, de manière à ce que les juifs et les musulmans qui s'étaient convertis à l'islam, eh bien, en fait, soient complètement écartés du fait d'être des sujets de la reine, de la citoyenneté, même si on ne parle pas encore de citoyenneté à l'époque, en disant qu'il fallait qu'ils prouvent ce qu'on appelle, enfin, qu'ils fassent la démonstration de la pureté de sang en produisant des documents en disant que leurs parents étaient eux-mêmes chrétiens et leurs grands-parents étaient eux-mêmes chrétiens. Donc ce lien, ça vise à dire finalement que la religion, c'est pas quelque chose auquel on se convertit, c'est quelque chose qui est transmis par le sang. Ça existe au moins depuis la période du Moyen-Âge, et déjà à cette époque, on essayait de disqualifier une partie de la population qu'on soupçonnait d'être potentiellement infidèles et d'être potentiellement subversifs. D'ailleurs, les juifs et les musulmans seront expulsés d'Espagne quelques années plus tard, en même temps que le début de la colonisation des Amériques, qu'on appelle vulgairement la découverte de l'Amérique par Christophe Colomb. Autre point que je pense être important, c'est que la France n'en est pas non plus à son coup d'essai dans son lien entre la question raciale et la question religieuse. Les musulmans en Algérie n'étaient pas, et les indigènes étaient qualifiés de musulmans. La religion était un statut aussi juridique. C'était aussi un statut politique, y compris pour ceux qui s'étaient convertis au christianisme. Il y a des archives du Conseil d'État où des musulmans indigènes convertis au christianisme demandent à ce que le statut personnel juridique des Français leur soit appliqué. Le Conseil d'État refuse. Le Conseil d'État dit que être un musulman, c'est pas simplement religieux, mais c'est aussi être de culture musulmane et donc avoir des parents musulmans. Donc on voit que également dans la question coloniale, la question génétique, la question raciale est au cœur des débats. En fait, il y a comme eu un recyclage finalement de ces questions au moment où on bascule et aujourd'hui, donc on passe de l'indigène à l'arabe au musulman et puis on a l'impression que c'est quelque chose de nouveau alors que déjà en Algérie coloniale, on avait cette question qui existait de manière très forte. Un autre point sur la question de la violence policière, il y a un livre qui vient d'être publié sur la légitime défense. Et ce livre est extrêmement intéressant puisque l'autrice, en l'occurrence, s'intéresse à depuis quand est-ce qu'en France on parle de légitime défense et quel est le profil, simplement, des personnes qui ont utilisé la légitime défense et qui ont été acquittées au nom de la légitime défense. Le point extrêmement intéressant qu'elle met en avant, c'est qu'elle montre que la légitime défense a commencé à être défendue par des juges du Conseil d'État à partir du moment où il y avait eu l'abolition de la peine de mort en France. Donc la question se pose de comment est-ce qu'on se débarrasse physiquement des indésirables auxquels on pouvait, dont on pouvait se débarrasser plutôt avec la peine de mort. La réponse est simple, en armant en fait les couches les plus privilégiées et en donnant l'autorisation aux policiers, aux forces armées de tirer sur un certain nombre de personnes et sur les populations considérées comme potentiellement dangereuses. Et elle fait un profil qui, somme toute, je pense, ne vous surprendra pas, qui utilise la légitime défense et est acquitté parce qu'il a utilisé la légitime défense, des hommes blancs dominants d'un certain âge qui défendent leurs biens ou qui font usage de leurs armes dans le cadre de leurs fonctions policières. Et parce qu'on a tendance aussi à oublier de dire que toutes, sans exception, tout ce qu'on appelle les émeutes en France, dont celle de 2005, et ce que moi j'appellerais plutôt des mouvements sociaux populaires, tous, sans exception, ont commencé à partir d'un crime policier. À partir du fait que des jeunes de banlieue aient été abattus par des policiers, certains avec des balles dans le dos, d'autres ont été poussés à aller jusqu'à dans des, comme Ziyad et Bouna, dans des lieux où ils ont été électrocutés. Donc il y a véritablement aussi un lien avec la question raciale et avec qui peut faire un usage légitime de la violence en France. Et qui peut faire aussi un usage légitime de la mixité ou de la non-mixité. En France, on a encore beaucoup de débats autour de est-ce que les racisés ont le droit de se retrouver, racialized people, est-ce qu'ils ont le droit de se retrouver entre eux pour discuter de politique. Vous en parlez très bien dans le livre, lorsque vous revenez sur le camp décolonial. En France, l'idée de faire un camp décolonial où ce seraient les premières concernées, donc les personnes racisées qui se retrouvent, a été objet de polémique et a même fait l'objet d'une plainte de la part des défenseurs des droits qui a considéré que c'était du racisme anti-blanc puisqu'on ne permettait pas aux blancs d'assister à ce camp décolonial. Donc la question de l'organisation autonome des populations discriminées, elle est extrêmement sensible et le cas des musulmans ne fait pas exception puisque que ce soit avec le CCIF, le collectif contre l'islamophobie en France, ou les autres tentatives d'organiser, en fait, to fight back, ce que vous disiez tout à l'heure, la question de qui lutte contre les dynamiques islamophobes mises en place par l'État, bien que le CCIF est très souvent disqualifié, Marwan Mohamed diabolisé en disant que c'était l'ancien président du CCIF, que c'est un avatar des frères musulmans en France, et toute personne qui serait peu ou prou en lien avec ces organisations est elle-même considérée comme étant potentiellement islamiste et devient persona non grata. D'ailleurs, c'est une question que j'ai oublié de vous poser tout à l'heure, c'est sur finalement comment l'islamophobie divise profondément le champ antiraciste français et comment des organisations historiques comme le MRAP, comme la LICRA, mettent à distance l'islamophobie comme étant une cause antiraciste légitime, respectable et donc digne d'être protégée et d'être portée.
Can I just add something to that before I forget it? So I think that's absolutely right. The point about invisibility of Muslims extends to the question of anti-racism. So it's not simply a question of Islamophobia dividing the anti-racist movement. There's a much more fundamental question, which is should the anti-racist movement be led by les premiers concernés? And so there's a battle for leadership, essentially, which when you look at some of the founders of SOS Racism and the statements that were made, for example, by the Minister for Women's Rights.
Laurence Rossignol.
Laurence Rossignol, when she was asked about the, many women choose to wear the hijab, and she said yes, but beaucoup de nègres were in favour of slavery. When you have a founder of France's major anti-racist organisation coming out with language like that, there is a profound crisis of anti-racism. And part of the difficulty is the difficulty that those directly affected by racism have in asserting their leadership over a movement that has lost its way. And so I think those questions are part of the debate. One of the interviews I did for the book was with one of the organisers of the Le Camp des Colonial. As we were speaking, her phone, was just pinging incessantly, and she just looked at these messages that came through, which were just dozens of messages. This is an outrage. Why are you organising this? This is du racisme anti-blanc. The fact that people can simply meet and talk about how to decolonize France, and the kind of thing that happens every day on university campuses in Britain and the US. And most of the responses weren't just from the far right, they were from left-wing activists who were appalled at the idea that people directly concerned by racism could organise amongst themselves. So there are a number of questions that can bring us back again to the question of the role of the Republican tradition in dividing movements that want to contest racism and Islamophobia.
Another round of questions. Sorry. So you can obviously, given that you're all bilingual, you can have questions in French or in English. Whatever is most convenient for you.
In my defense, I'm not bilingual in French, I'm bilingual in Spanish.
Oh, Spanish? I don't know.
I'll need a bit of help.
But that's okay. Okay, so 2 points. First, sort of the framing of this conversation is something that confuses me. Because, or at least it could be the fact that I'm very, very American and debates are a contact sport. But I guess there's a great deal upon which you both agree, and so I'm looking for the points of contestation, I suppose. So that's my first question. The second one being, so you mentioned that one of the causes of this movement towards sort of like more nuanced forms of racism, structural racism, and arguments that I find incredibly compelling, almost to the point of gospel really, is partially due to the fact that the social safety net here is under attack. The fact that my own home country does not really have a social safety net makes me think that that is not necessarily a cause, because I would assume that logically speaking, if the dismantling of the social safety net were sort of one of the primary factors in heightened, I want to say institutional justification for racist behavior on the part of the state, then France would be a markedly less racist place than the United States. And I can't necessarily say that that is the case.
Another question? 2 more questions.
Thank you. It's just I'm French by adoption. I'm Argentinian, and I always felt that there was something deeply hypocritical in the way French people were dealing with racism, and this is just so healthy. To read this book, I really enjoyed it. It explained lots of things of why, for me, the debates here were not right. And I'm a left-wing person, and I think the most appalling thing in that book is the depiction of how badly the left, center left, far left, is basically ostracizing even further the poorest, more marginalized, most discriminalized population of the country, doing nothing for them. And I would say not only doing nothing, but as you were saying, Fatima, even pushing them even farther over the cliff. So that for me, that's like probably the one element in that you develop the least is certainly one of the most painful ones in the book, coming from that progressive spectrum. I think one of the points you only refer to is not only that we don't like racialized people to take the lead of those movements, but I can hardly see any role where the French society is willing to see a Muslim leading on anything. I mean, the essentialization of Muslim people as if they were in any place, in any public space, they are there as Muslims and not as moms, teachers, union leaders, environmental activists. You just can't see them anywhere. Where UNEF put this union person that happened to have a hijab and the whole uproar about her. How can the union accept someone with a hijab speaking on behalf of students? Or I always laugh we on the evening sometimes we see CBBS, like the small baby chain of BBC, where sometimes there is a woman with a hijab reading the stories in the evenings, like anyone else. Like, yeah, someone with a hijab, someone sometimes with a handicap, sometimes just white Anglo-Saxon men. It's life. Never, ever in your life in France you will see that in television. Ever. So for me, we are invisibilizing them, but not only as leaders of their own community. We are invisibilizing Muslims as if they were just not able to speak on anything else as individuals. And for me, that's just simply appalling. And my question is, what do we do when outside political forces, like I'm working for an NGO, I used to work for unions, and the connection is just not there, basically because all those other groups tend to be led by white or not racialized individuals. There's lots of mistrust as well, lack of understanding between those movements. So I know researchers are rarely very directive on where should we go, but I think it would be nice to hear from you both. From the activist perspective, what's next? How do we get things better?
Okay, so they're quite big questions. I didn't quite get the bit about the France and the US.
So for example, if we were to write an equation and said these factors lead towards X expression of racism on a structural level, one of the things that you said was the social safety net should be one of those factors, one of those variables. So my point is that I would argue that it's not as big a factor in the sort of nationalism, drive towards racism, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, in all of these different spaces, because if that were the case, the United States has very little social safety net compared to France. Therefore, I would assume that the expression of racism would be less in France than in the United States. And I don't know that that is the case.
Yeah.
So it's sort of looking at a lot of folks post the election of my unfortunate current president saying that the drivers for his supporters were motivated by economics. Whereas that doesn't quite make sense to me, because if you look at the economic breakdown of the folks who voted for him, they run the gamut of the economic spectrum. The commonality is they're white. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to get onto the terrain of which country is more racist or which, that's not. Yes, the book's got a title that some people will be offended by, but it's really not about saying France is worse than anywhere else and so on. I think the point to draw out is there's an overlap of questions of race, class and religion, and there's a debate about how to confront racism in particular that's taking place in France that we've talked about, but is also taking place in the US. There's a fight for leadership of the anti-racist movement in the US with the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the contestation of some of the older leaders of that movement. So I think it's difficult to boil things down to an equation because situations aren't static. So that's I guess what I'm trying to say about the way in which the trajectory of the Islamophobic drift in French society has taken is not irreversible, and it's bound up with structural questions, but it's not determined and limited solely by them. So there's a scope for political intervention that can make a difference. So people build movements and come up against seemingly immovable objects, but find those objects, things that seemed impossible, can become possible when initiatives that are able to draw people in around a cause, often over very simple things, can have an impact. So if you think of, to take the example of France in 2002, those initiatives were almost spontaneous. People walking out of school when they saw Le Pen had come second in the presidential election. And this party that seemed to be a feature and a fixture of French political life suddenly became contested. And there have been several moments like that in the development of racist currents in French society where other possibilities have opened up that require seizing a political initiative. I could think of the split in the Front National was partly caused by people contesting the Front National Congress. They marched on a Congress in Strasbourg. That opened up divisions within the organisation. So I think what I'm trying to say about the overlap between questions of race being embedded in structures and overlapping with questions of class is it's no coincidence that France's Muslim population is overwhelmingly of migrant background and disproportionately poor. And so if in a context of social polarisation you have a political weapon, and I'm not just talking about secularism, that allows for those people to be blamed for their status as being among the poorest sections of French society. That's not that dissimilar a picture to some of the debates that take place in the US. I think that the question of leadership is particularly sharp in France, and the need for an independent leadership to develop to influence those struggles. So, how to confront the Republic of Islamophobia is really the same as how we confront these issues everywhere. And it's about identifying what are the key questions, and the most basic question is when you're confronted by prejudice and discrimination and racism and the stigmatizing of groups in society. Which side are you on? And having made that choice, what can you do in your workplace or your school or college to change the culture and the drift that's taking place? And often those start with very straightforward and small initiatives.